Marcus worked when the world was asleep. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the tall glass buildings, he put on his worn uniform and walked into the skyscraper that touched the night sky. The office floors sparkled with wealth and power. But for Marcus, they were places of silence, where his only company was the hum of machines and the faint glow of computer screens left on by busy executives. He was the janitor. To most people, just another shadow in the background. Employees passed him every day, but they rarely looked into his eyes. Some nodded politely, others ignored him completely, as if he blended into the walls he cleaned. Marcus didn't complain. He had learned long ago that respect wasn't given easily. When you pushed a mop instead of a pen, yet behind his quiet steps and tired hands, Marcus carried something no one expected. He was a thinker. Every night, while cleaning the massive conference rooms and polished desks, he observed the details of the company. The memos left open on printers, the charts scribbled on whiteboards, the conversations he overheard when he passed by late-night meetings. Marcus noticed everything. He didn't fully understand the language of business, but he understood people. He could tell when someone was stressed, desperate, or hiding something at home. Life wasn't easy. Marcus lived in a small apartment with peeling paint and a broken heater. Bills piled up on the table, and some nights he had to choose between paying for groceries or paying rent. Still, he carried himself with quiet dignity. He reminded himself that every shift meant survival. Every paycheck meant food on the table. And though his work often felt invisible, Marcus knew in his heart that invisible people often saw the most. The building he worked in belonged to one of the most powerful CEOs in the city, a billionaire whose name appeared in newspapers, on television, and across billboards. Marcus had never spoken to the man, but he cleaned his office every night. He saw the CEO's awards lined up in glass cabinets, his pictures with world leaders, and his leather chair that looked more like a throne than a seat. Sometimes Marcus paused in the office, staring at the view from the giant window. From there, the city looked like stars scattered on the ground. And Marcus wondered what it would feel like to belong to that world, to be someone important. But in reality, he returned to his mop, his vacuum, his silence. He worked quietly, making sure every corner shone by morning. No one praised him. No one asked how he was doing. But Marcus didn't let bitterness consume him. He found small joys instead. The sound of jazz on his old headphones as he polished the floor. The late-night security guard who shared a cup of coffee with him. The sense of pride when a floor gleamed so bright he could see his reflection. Still, deep inside, there was a heaviness Marcus carried. It was the weight of being overlooked. Every day, he wondered if anyone truly saw him not as a janitor, but as a man with dreams, fears, and intelligence. He sometimes imagined what it would be like if his life changed, if someone noticed his worth. But those thoughts felt like fantasies, too far away to ever become real. What Marcus didn't know was that life often hides its biggest tests in ordinary moments. That night, as he pushed his cart through the quiet office, the world was preparing. A strange twist for him, a test that would show whether the invisible worker was ready to be seen. The office phone on one of the desks began to ring. It was unusual. Most employees had already left for the night, and the calls usually stopped after business hours. Marcus froze, his hand tightening around the mop. He wasn't supposed to answer phones. That wasn't his job. And up at the sound echoed across the empty floor, sharp and insistent, as if it was calling only to him at first. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it would stop. Yet something inside him stirred. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fate. He slowly walked toward the desk, his heart beating faster with each step. The caller ID glowed on the small screen, showing a number with a country code Marcus didn't recognize. It was a foreign call. He hesitated. He was just a janitor. What if he got into trouble for picking it up? But another thought pushed into his mind. What if the call was important? What if someone truly needed help on the other side of the line? A shaky breath, Marcus reached out and lifted the receiver. His life had been full of routine, invisible nights, and silent struggles. But with that single choice, everything was about to change. The man who had been overlooked his whole life was about to step into a moment that would test his courage, his intelligence, and his heart. And though Marcus didn't know it yet, this was the night he would stop being invisible forever. Marcus stood frozen. The phone pressed against his ear, his heartbeat racing louder than the quiet hum of the office lights. At first, all he heard was static and a faint crackling sound, like the call had traveled across oceans before reaching him. Then a voice came through, a deep, rushed, desperate voice. "Hello, hello, this is urgent. I need to speak now." The man's English was broken, heavy with a foreign accent, but the urgency in his tone was clear. Marcus swallowed hard. His first instinct was to hang up. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't a secretary, not an assistant, not anyone important. He was just the janitor. His job was to clean, not to take calls that could change lives. But something in the caller's voice stopped him. It wasn't just business. There was panic, fear, a sense that if this message didn't get through, something terrible would happen. Marcus took a deep breath and spoke carefully. This is the office of the CEO, he said, hesitating. "The line is open." "What do you need?" The voice on the other end didn't wait. "I've been trying to reach him. No one answers. This is about the contract. If we don't fix this tonight, your company loses everything. You hear me? Everything." Marcus gripped the receiver tighter. He had no idea what contract the man was talking about. But the way the words tumbled out sharp, frantic, and heavy told Marcus this wasn't a small issue. Whoever this was, he wasn't bluffing. "Please," the caller continued, his voice almost shaking. "I represent our investors. Billions are on the line. We already lost trust. If this isn't corrected, we end partnership. No second chance." Marcus felt his mouth go dry. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest. He wanted to say, "I'm just a janitor. You've got the wrong person." But the desperation in the man's voice stopped him again. He realized this wasn't just a business deal. It was the kind of thing that could topple a company, ruin reputations, even destroy thousands of jobs. And right now, he was the only one on the line. "All right," Marcus said slowly, steadying his voice. "I hear you. Tell me what's wrong. I'll make sure the right people get this message." The man on the other end let out a long breath, almost like relief. He began speaking quickly, throwing out numbers, names, and terms Marcus didn't fully understand. But Marcus listened, carefully, scribbling everything down on a scrap of paper he found on the desk. His handwriting was messy, but his focus was razor sharp. The caller explained that a mistake in the company's recent deal had left the foreign investors feeling cheated. It wasn't about money alone. It was about trust. If they didn't get reassurance and corrections immediately, they would walk away. "You tell your boss," the caller said firmly. "This is his last chance. Tomorrow morning, decision is final." Marcus's hands trembled as he wrote those words. He knew enough to understand the gravity. Tomorrow morning. Final decision. Billions on the line. He tried to calm his voice. "I'll deliver this message. You have my word." There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then the caller spoke again, softer this time. "I hope your word means something, because if it doesn't, the world will hear about this failure." The line went dead. Marcus stood still, staring at the phone as if it might ring again. The quiet office suddenly felt heavier, the air thicker. His eyes dropped to the notes he had scribbled. They didn't look like much, just words, numbers, and broken sentences. But Marcus knew those words carried the weight of the company's future. For the first time in his life, Marcus wasn't invisible. He was the only one standing between disaster and salvation. He placed the receiver back slowly, his mind racing. What do I do now? He wasn't trained for this. If he told someone, would they even believe him? Wouldn't they laugh at the idea of a janitor handling $1 billion phone call? But deep inside, something told Marcus that he couldn't just walk away. The voice on the phone hadn't just been about business. It had been about urgency, about trust, about someone desperately needing to be heard. Marcus had heard him. And now it was up to Marcus to make sure others did too. He looked out the tall glass window of the CEO's office, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. Somewhere in those glowing towers, people were making decisions worth millions. And here he was, standing in the middle of a storm he never asked for. For years, Marcus had been overlooked, treated as just another shadow. But tonight, he carried a secret more powerful than anyone in that building could imagine. A secret that could save or destroy the empire they had built. As he folded the paper and slid it carefully into his pocket, Marcus whispered to himself, "No one may see me, but they'll hear me when it matters." And with that thought, the janitor who had always lived in silence prepared to step into a role he never dreamed was possible. Because sometimes fate doesn't knock politely. Sometimes it calls in the middle of the night from a foreign number and waits for someone brave enough to answer. Marcus could hardly sleep that night when he finally left the skyscraper. The city streets felt strangely alive, like the traffic lights and the buzzing neon signs were whispering to him about what had just happened. He walked home with a folded piece of paper still in his pocket, checking it again and again as if the words might vanish if he looked away. When he entered his small apartment, the silence wrapped around him. He dropped his keys on the table, sat down heavily, and pulled out the notes. His handwriting looked almost unreadable, hurried scribbles, numbers, half phrases. Yet every line carried weight. Marcus tried to piece it together, muttering aloud, as though the paper would answer him back. What does this even mean? He whispered. He wasn't a businessman. He didn't know the language of contracts, negotiations, or billion-dollar deals. All he knew was that a man thousands of miles away had believed he was speaking to the CEO and had poured out a storm of frustration and fear into his ears. The confusion grew inside Marcus like a fire. Why him? Why this moment? Why had no one else been there to take that call? He was just the janitor, the invisible worker. He polished glass, scrubbed carpets, emptied bins. And now he was sitting in his apartment, staring at what might be the most important message in the company's history. The weight of it pressed down on him. What if he misunderstood? What if he wrote it down wrong? What if, because of his mistake, the company lost everything? His stomach twisted with doubt. Marcus leaned back, rubbing his eyes. You shouldn't have answered that call, he told himself. You should have left it. Not your job, not your business. But then another thought pushed back a memory of the caller's voice, sharp with urgency, cracking with desperation. The man hadn't cared who was on the other side. He had needed to be heard. And Marcus had listened. He closed his eyes and thought of the office. He had spent years in that building, unseen but never unknowing. He remembered faces, conversations, and whispers left behind when the powerful believed no one else was listening. He remembered how often executives tossed around words like contracts, deadlines, investors, as if they were puzzle pieces scattered across the air. Maybe, just maybe, he could make sense of this puzzle too. Marcus spread the paper on the table, smoothing it with his rough hands. He took out an old notebook from a drawer one he had used to practice his writing years ago, started copying the words more neatly, He repeated each phrase out loud, trying to connect them to things he had overheard in the building. And, slowly, like a fog clearing at sunrise, a picture began to form. The client overseas wasn't just upset about money. He felt cheated, betrayed, as though the company had hidden something in the fine print. Trust had been broken. That was the word Marcus circled over and over again. Trust. The more he thought about it, the more his confusion turned into something else: understanding. He remembered a meeting he had overheard months ago when two executives argued late into the night. They had mentioned rushing a deal and covering details later. At the time, Marcus hadn't understood. But now those memories clicked together with the caller's words, like puzzle pieces snapping into place. The company hadn't just made a small mistake. They had overlooked something huge. And now, the entire foundation of their biggest contract was cracking. Marcus sat back, breathing hard. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at what he had written. This wasn't just a janitor's guess, was a real problem. One he could clearly see now, but the confusion hadn't ended. Another question burned inside him. What do I do with this? If he walked into the CEO's office tomorrow morning, no one would let him near the man. Security would laugh, assistants would sneer, executives would roll their eyes. Who would ever believe a janitor knew something they didn't? He imagined himself standing there, holding the paper, trying to explain. He imagined the CEO's cold glare, the dismissal in his voice. Stay in your lane. Know your place. Marcus's chest tightened. He knew what it felt like to be ignored, dismissed, invisible. The fear of it almost made him tear the paper to shreds and forget everything. But then he remembered the caller's last words. Tomorrow morning. Final decision. There was no time for fear. If he did nothing, the company would fall. And maybe the CEO would never know that one man, working late at night with a mop in his hands, had the chance to save it all. Marcus folded the notes carefully, tucking them back into his pocket like treasure. He stood up, walked to the window of his small apartment, and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere high in that skyline, the CEO was likely sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm coming his way. Marcus clenched his fist. Confusion still swirled in his mind, but beneath it, something else was forming resolve. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing: he couldn't stay silent. Not this time. The janitor who had always been overlooked now carried the power to change everything. And though his heart raced with doubt, Marcus whispered to himself, tomorrow they'll have to hear me, even if they don't want to. And as the night stretched on, Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The confusion hadn't gone away, but it had sharpened into something stronger. The choice was no longer about whether he was capable. It was about whether he had the courage to step forward when the world expected him to stay silent. Because sometimes, even in the middle of confusion, the truth becomes too powerful to ignore. Marcus woke the next morning with little sleep in. His eyes but fire in his chest. The paper with his notes lay on the small table beside his bed, folded neatly as though it were more precious than gold. He stared at it for a long moment before slipping it into his pocket. That piece of paper carried the weight of $1 billion decision, and now it was up to him to decide what to do with it. For most of his life, Marcus had been told where he belonged, in the background, unseen, unheard, cleaning up after the powerful. He had accepted it quietly because it was safe. But last night's call had pushed him to a crossroad. He could stay invisible, keep the notes hidden, and watch as the company fell apart. Or he could step forward and risk everything to make sure the truth was heard. As he dressed for work, Marcus looked at himself in the cracked mirror. His uniform was still the same faded color, his shoes scuffed and worn. He still looked like a janitor. But inside, something had shifted. He wasn't just going to clean floors today. He was going to fight to be heard. The bus ride to the city felt longer than usual. Marcus sat by the window, his thoughts racing faster than the cars outside. What if they laugh at me? What if they throw me out? But then another voice whispered inside him, stronger this time. What if you're right? What if you save them? By the time the skyscraper came into view, Marcus's palms were sweaty and his heart thumped like a drum. He walked through the front doors as he had every morning, blending in like a shadow. But unlike every other day, he didn't head straight to his cart of cleaning supplies. He went toward the elevators, his notes pressed firmly in his pocket. When the doors opened, Marcus stepped into the gleaming lobby of the top floor of the CEO's world. Everything here was polished, elegant, and intimidating. Assistants bustled, with files in their hands, voices sharp and fast as they spoke into phones. Security guards stood tall, their eyes narrowing when Marcus walked in. He didn't belong here, and everyone knew it. "Excuse me, sir," one of the guards said firmly, stepping in his way. "This floor isn't for staff." Marcus's throat tightened. His first instinct was to step back, to apologize and disappear like he always did. But he forced himself to stand tall. His voice shook, but he spoke clearly. "I need to see the CEO," he said. "It's urgent." The guard frowned, almost amused. "The CEO? Do you know how many people say that every day? You've got to leave." Marcus pulled the folded paper from his pocket, his hands trembling. "Please, just look at this. It's about a contract. If he doesn't hear this, the company could lose everything by tomorrow morning." The guard hesitated, unsure. But one of the assistants nearby overheard and let out a laugh. "What's this? The janitor thinks he's saving the company now." A few others chuckled, shaking their heads, ready to dismiss him as nothing more than a dreamer. Marcus felt the sting of humiliation rise in his chest, but he refused to back down. He unfolded the paper, holding it out with steady determination. "I took a call last night," he said, louder this time so everyone could hear. It was from one of the biggest clients overseas. They said if this problem isn't fixed by morning, they're pulling out. Billions are at risk. Oh. I wrote down everything, every word. The assistant's smirk faded slightly, replaced by uncertainty. She glanced at the paper, then at Marcus's face. There was no arrogance there, no lie. Only raw, desperate honesty. "Let me see that," she muttered. Reaching for the notes, she scanned the messy handwriting, her eyes widening as she recognized key terms and names. Suddenly, the laughter stopped. She looked at Marcus again, this time not with mockery, but with shock. "Wait here," she whispered, her voice unsteady. She hurried into the CEO's office, clutching the paper. Marcus stood still, his heart pounding. The guards exchanged uneasy looks. A heavy silence filled the lobby. Every second felt like an hour. Finally, the assistant reappeared. "He'll see you," she said quietly. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. For the first time in his life, he was about to walk into the office of the most powerful man in the city, not as a cleaner, but as the bearer of a truth that could save everything. He straightened his shoulders and stepped forward. The door closed behind him, and suddenly it was just Marcus, the CEO, and the weight of $1 billion crisis between them. For Marcus, this was more than a meeting. It was his bold choice, his decision to step out of the shadows and risk being seen, even if it meant ridicule, even if it meant failure. And as the CEO's piercing eyes studied him, Marcus knew there was no turning back. Marcus left the CEO's office that evening with his mind spinning. He had spoken, he had been heard, but the weight of what he had revealed sat heavy on his chest. The CEO had taken the notes, yes, but the man's expression had been cold, unreadable. There had been no thanks, no reassurance, just a curt nod. And the promise to look into it. As Marcus walked home through the crowded streets, the noise of the city seemed distant. Cars honked, people laughed, neon lights blinked above him, but he felt like he was walking in a bubble of silence. Uff. The problem wasn't solved yet, it was only passed forward, and Marcus couldn't shake the fear that the CEO might ignore it. That his words would be tossed aside like dust swept into a corner. That night, Marcus sat alone in his small apartment, the paper scraps spread across the table once more. He couldn't let them go. He couldn't stop replaying the phone call in his head. Every word, every pause, every crack in the caller's voice, it haunted him. Sleep refused to come. Every time Marcus closed his eyes, he saw the face of the desperate man on the other side of the world, heard his voice saying, "Tomorrow morning." Final decision. The clock ticked past midnight. Then 1, then 2. Marcus sat at the table with a pencil in hand, scribbling notes, trying to piece the puzzle together even more clearly. He wasn't trained in business, but he had something just as powerful. Memory. He remembered conversations he had overheard while cleaning boardrooms late at night. He remembered executives whispering about deadlines and loopholes. He remembered the anger in one manager's voice when she said, "If the client finds out, it'll blow up everything." At the time, Marcus hadn't understood. But now those fragments aligned perfectly with the caller's warnings. He flipped open his old notebook and started writing a timeline. Dates, names, overheard details, all of it. His handwriting was rough, but the story it told was sharp. The company had rushed a deal, hidden flaws, and gambled on the client never noticing. But the client had noticed, and now the trust was shattered. Marcus leaned back, staring at his work. For years, people had looked at him and seen only a janitor. Yet here he was, holding knowledge that the entire executive board had missed. It made his chest ache with pride and fear at the same time. The night stretched on. At 3 in the morning, Marcus made coffee in his chipped mug, the bitter taste keeping his eyes wide open. At 4, he stood by his window, watching the city lights flicker like restless stars. His thoughts chased themselves in circles. What if they don't act? What if I didn't do enough? But then another thought pushed through the fog of doubt. What if this is the reason I answered that call? What if this is why fate chose me, of all people? Marcus sat down again and pressed his pencil harder against the paper. He wasn't just going to leave this to chance. If the CEO ignored him, he would make sure there was proof, solid, undeniable proof that he had carried the warning. He recopied his notes neatly, made 2 copies, and tucked them safely away. By dawn, his apartment was covered in paper, scattered notes, timelines, fragments of conversations. Marcus rubbed his tired eyes, exhaustion pulling at him, but he refused to rest. There was too much at stake. He thought of the thousands of employees in the skyscraper, people who depended on their jobs to feed their families. If the client pulled out, those jobs could vanish overnight. For the first time, Marcus realized he wasn't just carrying a message. He was carrying the weight of people's livelihoods, their futures, their dreams. As the first light of morning slipped through the window, Marcus sat slumped in his chair. His body was weary, but his spirit burned stronger than ever. He whispered to himself, "I can't stop now. Not until this is fixed." His sleepless night hadn't broken him. It had prepared him. By sunrise, Marcus wasn't just a janitor. Anymore, he was a man armed with knowledge, memory, and determination. He was ready to fight, no matter how high the walls around him were. The day ahead would be dangerous for him, full of rejection, disbelief, maybe even humiliation. But after a night of staring into the storm, Marcus had made his choice. He would not stay silent. He would make sure the truth reached the right ears, no matter the cost. And as he gathered the papers into his bag and stepped out of his apartment, into the rising sun, Marcus knew one thing with absolute clarity. Sleepless nights are not a curse when they forge courage. Sometimes they are the fire that prepares ordinary people for extraordinary battles. Asterisk Marcus arrived at the skyscraper, with the rising sun behind him. The glass walls glowed gold, but to Marcus, the building looked less like a workplace and more like a fortress. He had barely slept, his eyes heavy, but his spirit was alive, sharpened by the sleepless night of writing and rewriting his notes. Today, he wasn't here to mop floors or polish glass. Today, he was here to confront power itself. He walked into the lobby gripping his bag tightly, his fingers brushing against the papers he had copied and recopied during the long night. Each page was proof, each line of scribbled ink a piece of the truth he carried. He whispered to himself, "Don't back down, Marcus. Not today." The elevator ride to the top floor felt endless. The mirrored walls reflected his tired face, his worn uniform, his nervous eyes. He looked like a janitor, yes, but beneath the surface, he was a man carrying the company's lifeline. The higher the elevator climbed, the louder his heart pounded when the doors opened. The air on the executive floor was cold and sharp, filled with the sound of ringing phones and rapid footsteps. Assistants hurried by with papers in hand, their expressions tense. Something was already wrong. The tension was thick, like the entire floor was waiting for a disaster. Marcus stepped forward. And just like before, security blocked him. "You again," one guard said, crossing his arms. "Look, we told you yesterday." Marcus didn't let him finish. His voice, though shaky, was louder than before. "I'm here for the CEO. I have the notes. The client's final decision is today. If he doesn't hear this now, your company loses everything." The guard frowned, ready to push him back, but Marcus's determination burned through his fear. He pulled out the papers from his bag and held them up. "I stayed awake all night. I wrote down every detail. This isn't a joke. If you stop me, you'll be the reason your company falls." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then, as if fate had timed it, the CEO's assistant stepped out of the office, her face pale. She looked at Marcus, then at the papers in his hands. Recognition flashed across her eyes. She remembered him from yesterday. "Let him in," she said firmly. The guards exchanged confused glances, but they stepped aside. Marcus's chest tightened as he walked past them and into the CEO's office. The room was enormous, lined with shelves of books and trophies, with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city like a painting. Behind the heavy desk sat the CEO himself, a man whose presence filled the room like a storm. His suit was perfect, his expression unreadable, his eyes sharp as blades. He looked up slowly. "You again," the CEO said, his voice low, controlled. The janitor, Marcus, swallowed hard. He could feel his knees wanting to buckle, but he stood tall. "Yes, sir, me again. I told you yesterday." But this, he placed the papers on the desk with trembling hands. "This is everything. The client's warning, their demands, their deadline. If this isn't fixed today, they're gone." The CEO leaned back, staring at the papers without touching them. The silence stretched painfully, broken only by the distant sound of the city far below. "You understand what you're suggesting?" the CEO finally said. His tone wasn't mocking, but it wasn't kind either. "You're claiming you know something my executives don't. You're claiming you understand a billion-dollar contract." Marcus took a deep breath. "No, sir. I don't understand the business language, but I understood the man's voice. He wasn't lying. He was desperate. And I remembered things I've heard here. Conversations, arguments. They all connect. You may not believe me because of who I am, but the truth doesn't care if I'm a janitor or not." For the first time, the CEO's eyes softened just slightly. He leaned forward, picking up the papers, scanning Marcus's handwriting. His brows furrowed as he read, his jaw tightening. The skyscraper had never felt so alive. The crisis had passed, the client had signed, and the weight of collapse had lifted from every corner of the building. Phones rang with good news instead of panic. Assistants moved with relief instead of fear, and executives allowed themselves the rare sound of laughter. But Marcus, the man at the center of it all, still stood quietly in the background. He leaned against the wall of the CEO's office, his uniform slightly wrinkled, his hands rough from years of work. The whirlwind of victory didn't belong to him, more so he thought. He had done his part. He had carried the message, spoken the truth, and helped save the company. That was enough. At least, that's what he believed. The CEO, however, saw things differently. As the board gathered in the grand conference room that evening, the atmosphere shifted once more. These were the most powerful men and women in the company, used to decisions worth billions. They sat around the long, polished table, expecting to hear the CEO deliver his usual commanding words. But when the CEO entered, his gaze wasn't on them. It was on Marcus, who followed hesitantly a few steps behind. The executives looked puzzled. Some frowned, whispering to each other, "Why is he here? He doesn't belong." The CEO raised a hand for silence. His voice cut through the room, strong and deliberate. "Before we begin, I want you all to understand something. Yesterday, we were on the edge of ruin. This company was hours away from losing its greatest client. And the reason we are standing strong today is not because of us, not because of this board, not because of our titles, not because of our wealth." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then he gestured toward Marcus. "It is because of him." The room fell into stunned silence. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his cheeks warm under the stares of men and women who had never noticed him before. "This man," the CEO continued, "a janitor who most of us have walked past without a glance, chose not to stay silent. He answered a call none of us heard. He carried a warning none of us received. He saw connections we ignored. And because of that, we saved not only a client, but the future of this company." Whispers rippled through the room. Some executives nodded slowly. Others looked at Marcus with disbelief, as though struggling to accept that someone so ordinary had done something so extraordinary. The CEO's voice rose, cutting through their doubts. "Titles don't make heroes. Actions do. And when the moment came, it wasn't one of us who rose to the challenge. It was him." He stepped closer to Marcus, his expression softer now. "For too long, we have treated people like him as invisible. Today, that ends. Today, we recognize the man who saved us all." The boardroom filled with reluctant applause, which soon grew louder, genuine. For the first time in his life, Marcus felt every eye not just look at him, but see him. Truly see him. Tears stung his eyes, but he held them back. He stood tall, his chin lifted, his heart pounding with pride. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was Marcus, the man who had been underestimated, overlooked, and ignored, but who had proven that courage and truth could come from anywhere. The CEO turned to him and said words Marcus would never forget. "You've earned more than our thanks. You've earned a place among us. Starting today, your role here changes." The assistants gasped. The executives sat up straighter. Marcus blinked in shock. "Sir, I don't understand." "You will," the CEO said firmly. "No longer will you sweep floors in silence. From this day forward, you will work with my team directly. You've shown you can see what others miss, and I need men like that by my side." Marcus's throat tightened. His hands trembled. He had walked into this building that morning as a janitor. Now, by evening, he was being lifted into a world he had only ever watched from afar. Applause thundered again. Echoing off the glass walls, Marcus felt. It vibrates in his chest. For the first time, it wasn't pity or politeness. It was respect. Real, undeniable respect. When the meeting ended, executives shook his hand, some awkwardly, some with genuine warmth. Assistants smiled at him with admiration. The same guards who had once blocked his way now nodded respectfully as he passed. That night, as Marcus walked home through the glowing city streets, the world felt different. He looked up at the skyscrapers, not as walls of power that excluded him, but as places where he belonged. At home, he sat at his small table, the same place where he had stayed awake, scribbling notes just a night before. He placed his hands flat against the wood, closed his eyes, and whispered, "I'm not invisible anymore." The janitor who once lived in the shadows had become the unlikely hero of a billionaire empire. Not because of luck, not because of power, but because he had chosen courage when it mattered most. And though Marcus's journey was far from over, one truth burned clear in his heart. Heroes can come from anywhere. And sometimes the greatest victories begin with the most ordinary hands.